If you have a story you'd like to see featured on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. Hello, Marie. Thank you for doing such great work. I hope you are having a great start to the year. I thought about sending you this story, but I needed to check my facts with my sister beforehand. This was in the early 90s, and I don't remember why my sister and I were home alone. My sister was around 14 years old, and I was 11. At this time, we lived in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, and we were bored. We decided to take a walk after leaving a note for my mom, and then we took off. Now, this town was about 20 houses at most. The only thing it had was a post office. There was an old school that was overgrown, but had a basketball hoop that was still standing. We walked past the school and made our way to an old rail crossing. The tracks had been removed, but it had not gotten overgrown yet. We followed the old trail deeper into the woods and caught sight of a rock wall that looked easy to climb. So we decided to climb up and see what we could see. This climb was taller than we thought. It was only about 100 feet or so, but it was steep. I think it was a hill that the rail company had blasted out of the way. This left a rugged cliff that was pretty sheer. The old drill holes left us a way to climb. They had rough edges that we could grab. This made the climb seem easier than it really was. As we were going up, my sister had knocked a rock loose that hit my face and knocked my glasses off. I wanted to stop then, to at least get my glasses, but my sister just said we should get them on the way back. At the top of the hill, we realized that it was the edge of a plateau, I guess. It was a flat spot that had been cleared by logging. It's hard to explain. From below, it looked like a small hill in that we could get a good look of the valley. Instead, it was a foothill or a small mountain range. This flat spot leading to mountains in the distance. There were no trees left standing. All the trunks were grayed and decaying. The undergrowth had run rampant. Vines tried to catch your feet. Old sticks covered holes in the ground. It would have been so easy to turn an ankle or break a leg. We wandered for a while and noticed it was getting dark. We needed to get home. I think we were already late. Our mom was going to be worried. We hadn't marked our trail, so it took some time to find our way back to where we came up. Looking around was hard for me. Without my glasses, anything outside of 3 feet was blurry. When we made it back, I was trying to find a place to climb down, or at least where we could climb up. When we couldn't figure it out, my sister suggested jumping. In her words, it's not that far, plus the bushes would break our fall. Without my glasses, I couldn't tell if it really was a long way down or not, but I was not going to jump. We stood there and argued for a time. I finally told her, "Jump if you want. I am going to find a house and ask to use the phone." I started to walk away, afraid that my sister was going to jump. She was headstrong like that, but she followed. I had a hard time in the dark. Neither of us thought to bring flashlights. Eventually, we found a house with lights on. Apparently, either people went to bed early around here, or it was mostly vacation homes. I was almost ready to try and break into a house just to use the phone. My sister took the lead and knocked on the door. A nice woman answered. She wouldn't let us inside. Her daughter was sick with a fever and didn't want to pass it to us. So she brought out her phone and she even wiped it with alcohol before handing it over. My sister left a message for my mom. She was out looking for us and handed the phone back. The woman asked if we were able to get a hold of our mom, and my sister said no. The lady asked us what we wanted to do, and I said if you can point us to our town, we will start walking. I didn't think we could be that far from home since we walked here. When I told her what town we were from, she was shocked. Apparently, going over the cliff and through the flat rise took us about 25 minutes from our town by car. The road back had to go around the rise and then double back to get to our house. When we said that we would start walking, she objected. She went back inside real quick and checked on her child. She then told us that she would drive us home. This lady was so nice. She left her sick kid at home to drive us lost kids home. When we got home, our car wasn't in the driveway, but not 5 seconds after, our mom pulled up. Mom was so happy to see us. Apparently, she had been out driving the route we said we were going to use in our note. From what she said, she had been driving on the shoulder at like 5 miles an hour trying to find us. Not only that, but our little lapdog Holly, who was the size of a cat, was sniffing the air and barking like she smelled us. My mom would stop the car and get out to let Holly try and find us. She had been coming back every so often to check the phone or see if we made it home. So when we were standing in the driveway, she rushed to hug us. After exchanging some words with the lady and profusely thanking her, Mom let the lady leave. The next day, we went to look for my glasses because we couldn't afford to buy new ones. When my sister saw the cliff and how high it was, she looked at me and said, "I'm glad you talked me out of jumping." When my mom heard this, she looked mortified. "You thought of jumping down? It's like 100 feet. In reality, it was only about half that. Still enough to seriously damage or kill us. At the base of the cliff, we found my glasses too. They only had a small scuff on the metal where the rock had hit me. Anyway, thank you for reading this, Marie. I am a fan of your work. Thank you." My camping story comes from a time when I was actually still a child. Probably around 12 years old at the absolute oldest. Back when I was young, my dad wanted to get me into hunting. He was a hunter, his dad was a hunter, and so on. Me, I never really had the drive to kill an animal, even for food. While I understand that he was trying to instill a sense of survivalism in me and trying to teach me what I would have to do if society collapsed, I'm now 47 and society has yet to collapse. At this point, if it did, I'd probably just accept it and live off of cans of Spam for a few months before I succumb to the elements. Completely irrelevant to the story, my apologies. Anyways, this story took place on a hunting trip that my dad had set up for myself and him during the summer break of that year. He had planned to take me out to a hunting ground that he used to hunt on and that his friend owned. The plan was that we would sit up there and find the hunting tower and just wait for deer to come along to shoot them. Pretty standard hunting trip, really. We got all of our gear together and we headed out early in the morning to get to the spot where he and I would be setting up the tents. I packed more than I needed, mostly because I was the kind of kid that would throw a fit about having to wear the same pants for days in a row, and we were supposed to be out for the whole weekend. After lugging everything into the truck, double checking to make sure we had our tents and camping equipment, I got in the car and, to be completely honest with you, fell asleep as soon as the tires hit the asphalt. I knew he drove for an hour or two, and then I woke up to the feeling of the truck going off the road and onto the gravel dirt paths. He pulled up to the spot where we were supposed to be at, and he asked if I was excited. I told him I was, despite the fact that I was barely cognizant. We grabbed our tents and all of our gear and whatnot. Then I asked him where we were supposed to set up the tents. Much to my dismay, he tells me that we have to hike about 10 minutes to get close to the lookout tower. I remember the look on his face when I stared daggers at him. He laughed his ass off. Then we started to trek out into the woods. After about 10 minutes or so, he pointed to where the tower was and told me that was where we would be the next morning when we actually started hunting. Then he told me to set up the tents. Plural. I asked what he was going to be doing, and he said that he was going to scout the area and see what was around. Then he dropped his tent and told me he'd be back in a little bit. At first, I was pissed that he was making me do all the work, but I went to it. I set up his tent first to be nice, and then I started struggling with mine. After having a difficult time with it and saying words that my dad would have swatted me for, I finally got them both set up and got our gear in the respective tents. After that, I actually got in mine and went back to sleep. I wasn't asleep that long, probably 15 minutes or so, and I was woken up by my dad shouting my name close by. I quietly responded saying, "Yeah, Dad, I'm in my tent," and then put my head back down. Then I was shaken awake by my dad opening the tent and telling me that I needed to get up now. I asked what was going on, thinking at first that he was just messing with me, but the look on his face quickly told me that he wasn't joking. I got up and exited my tent, and he told me that we needed to leave immediately. I told him that we just got there and asked why we needed to go, and he told me to come with him to the truck so we could leave. I asked about our camping gear, and he basically told me to shut up and do what he told me to. Being 12, I wasn't going to argue with him any more than I had. So at this point, my dad had dragged me away from the campground, left all of our gear out there, and was in a hurry to leave, so the only thing I could think to do was ask what was wrong. He didn't respond at first, but when I asked again, he once again told me to stop asking questions and kept driving. Obviously, I was annoyed, but I just sat there and stared out the window and pouted. I got even more confused when he pulled into the police station and told me to stay in the car. I was going to ask why, but he was quick to get out and run up to the station before I could. I just continued to sit there and stare at nothing in particular. Then after about 10 minutes, he ran back out and we got back on the road, but this time a cop cruiser was following us. Before I could ask anything, he literally told me to keep my mouth shut and not ask any more questions at all. He pulled back up to the spot where our gear was and told me to stay put. Then he and an officer started to walk off into the forest. Again, I was 12, and it was the late 80s. I was not about to just sit there and do nothing, bored out of my mind. Honestly, I kind of wish I had. I waited for a few minutes and then followed behind my dad and the officer, just far enough that I knew where they were, but was distant enough to have them probably not notice me. I followed them for a bit, then they stopped, and my dad and the officer were standing by a broken fence line. Basically, it looked like someone had knocked down the post to a barbed wire fence, and it hadn't been replaced yet. I just stood there and I heard my dad explaining things to the officer. He told him that we were there to hunt over the weekend, that he knew the owner of the land and that he was just walking the perimeter to check things out. Then he said that he noticed a damaged fence and went to check it out. Then he said I came over to check the damage so I could let him know, and that's when I saw her. I may have been young, but I was able to put two and two together. Him freaking out, wanting to leave, getting the police, and it's exactly what you're thinking it was. Apparently, when he went ahead and checked out the area, he saw a woman's body lying in the brush. I later found out that it was actually a girl that was around 16 that had gone missing only a couple days before, and the cops had determined that her body was likely to have been dumped by whoever had taken her. So this was literally my one and only hunting trip, and the only time I ever went camping. And I can technically say that I did go camping because I slept in the tent for a little while, and that means it was camping. Jokes aside, this is the only time my dad took me out for one of these trips, and I don't think he even got together with his buddies to hunt after this. Apparently, there's something about finding a dead body in the woods that ruins camping for you, no matter how long you've been doing it. I used to work for a company that did a lot of survey work out in the woods and national forest areas. Basically, we were paid to walk the trails, take pictures of everything around, and report anything we find back to the park services. It may seem like a really weird and pointless job, but it's more about trying to determine if we have people coming out and using the land for things they shouldn't, camping in parts of the forest that are considered off limits, and also to survey wildlife. Sometimes we get migratory animals that make nests in parks of the trails that are open to the public, and if that happens, we have to shut that part of the trail off as it's illegal to disturb them. It's one of those positions that most people really don't even know exists, and it's probably one of the most important ones for the park services in my area. Now, doing this job was mostly uneventful. It was a pretty by-the-book kind of position where I just had to determine what information was relevant, irrelevant, and write out the reports with photographs. That may upset some people. A lot of people out there seem to believe that being out in natural parks all day, every day, must be super exciting and eventful. It's not. Go walk around the paths for a day, and then multiply what you see by 5, and that's a normal week for us. That said, we did see some weird stuff sometimes. A lot of the time, we would just see homeless people trying to set up small gatherings in places that they weren't allowed to, or drug addicts getting lost on the trails after a bad trip. Sometimes we'd find things that were a bit odd, but again, it was mostly tame. I actually have 2 specific stories I wanted to share that were both pretty creepy. The first one happened during one of my first outings. I was still working as a trainee, and I was required to go out with one of the more seasoned employees for the entire thing. They pretty much teamed you up with someone that was a senior for the first year, and then after that, you were expected to do the work on your own. On my first survey, I was with an older gentleman named Dan. Dan had been doing this job for somewhere close to 12 or so years. Having done this for so long, there wasn't much that Dan wasn't accustomed to. He'd pretty much seen it all and knew exactly what to do at all times. On the first outing, we had to camp out for a majority of the trip, as there weren't any nearby ranger stations for what we were doing, which was fine by me as I've always loved camping and hiking, hence why I took the position I did. Anyways, we were set up on our second or third night, the tents were ready to go, and we were finishing up dinner. At around the time the sun had fully set and it was pitch black, and we were about ready to call it a night, I started hearing what sounded like something rustling around a bit to our south. It was like something or someone was walking a bit beyond the tree line, and I couldn't see them. This isn't abnormal at all. When you're out in the woods, you encounter tons of wildlife like deer or foxes, and typically you can just ignore it and continue on with your evening. I just assumed it was something like that, but when I looked over at Dan, I noticed he had a service weapon in his hand and was staring out into the trees. I asked him what was wrong, and no later than the last word exiting my mouth did we hear what sounded like a child screaming at the top of their lungs. When I say screaming, I mean like they were yelling in absolute agony, and it 100% sounded childlike, high-pitched, whiny, and followed with what was almost a sobbing sound. I stood up confused and started looking over to where it came from. Dan grabbed my arm and pulled me back down as he watched the darkness. I asked him what the hell that was, and he just looked at me and said, "I have no earthly idea, but we're going to treat it like it was just a coyote and not pay any more attention than what we have." I was beyond confused, but the stern look that he was giving me was enough to tell me that I needed to follow his lead. I nodded and we both turned in for the night. I will say that nothing else did happen. It never got any closer to us, and there was nothing around in the morning. but I laid there the entire night with my firearm near my hand and ready just in case. The second story happened closer to the end of my tenure with the company and was probably the weirdest thing that any of us had ever found on one of our surveys. It started pretty normal. I was on a trip by myself as I wasn't training anyone, and I was about done with the whole thing when on one of my trips, I saw what looked like a small hole in the ground off the trails. When I say off the trails, I mean practically in the middle of nowhere in this forest. There weren't a lot of people that came out this way, honestly. Never had any issues with the surveys out here. I walked over to the spot where it looked like it had either been dug at or sunk, and I noticed that something was covered in leaves that had collected there. I shoved them out of the way and was surprised to see what seriously looked like a manhole cover. It was round and metal and was pretty damn heavy. I was able to lift it up and kind of roll it over to the side when I realized why it looked like the spot had sunk in. Because it had. I was looking down a concrete tunnel into what looked like a bunker that had collapsed inside. This area wasn't owned by anyone, and there was no one that should have been living here. And this bunker wasn't marked on any maps or any documentation. I grabbed my radio and I called it into the station. They told me to stay there and informed me that they would call the authorities to check it out. They did, and I was pretty spot on with my guess. It was a bunker. It was a nuclear fallout shelter, to be exact, one that apparently no one knew existed, built sometime in the Cold War most likely. Because of what it was and the fact that no one knew what could be in the bunker, they had determined that they actually had to dig it up, which I completely understand. There was no way of knowing if there were illegal items down there or potentially dangerous ones. They dug it up with an actual excavator and found some interesting things. First and foremost, the person that was living there, he was long dead, most likely just a skeleton at the point that we found him, which told me that he had probably passed away years ago, and no one realized he was there. It was pretty weird as they couldn't find anything that identified who he was or why he was there, or honestly how he had managed to build and hide the bunker for so long. There wasn't anything illegal in the bunker, just a lot of canned food and books, as well as a few photos of seemingly random landscapes. It's the weirdest thing that this guy had managed to build this bunker that long ago and fly under the radar. My thoughts are that he built it and just never left. This begs the question of why? Why did he decide to just go underground like that? To the best of my knowledge, they never identified who he was at all, and he is basically a John Doe. This was several years ago at this point, so he probably fell into the cold case file as there wasn't any evidence of foul play, and he likely died of natural causes. It's just that no one found him or knew until the bunker had collapsed. In the end, he went off the grid, and even after death, that's where he remained. This story takes place back when I was a teenager. Back then, I lived with my parents in a part of South Dakota that had a lot of wilderness, and I was one to always take advantage of the woods in the area. I was all about heading out onto the trails in the woods to see what I could find out there, and I loved to spend my weekends hiking and finding new areas. We lived near a small pond that was right by a small section of woods that is by a cave system. I spent way too many hours of my teen years in that cave system, and I honestly loved to spend my entire days out in the wild just taking in the sights and sounds. That said, nothing is perfect, and there were a few close calls I had when I was young and thought I was invincible. I once fell from a pretty high ledge when I was 13 and broke my arm, and thankfully that was all I broke, because I could have died. No, that's not the scary story. Just a point of note that tells you who I am as a person. A risk taker. An idiot, essentially. I used to go out and do pretty much whatever to whenever, and then head home and do it all again the next day. Like I said, nothing is perfect, and I can recall 2 specific stories that made me feel like maybe spending all of my time out in the wilderness where no one knew where I was, maybe that wasn't such a great idea in the end. The first incident happened during one summer where there was a good amount of foot traffic in the area. Some years there would be more tourism than others. We weren't really a tourism city, but some people that were nature buffs would stop in the area for the scenery. Like I said, this year was one we had more people in the area. On this day in particular, I wanted to go down to the pond and just watch the animals down the way. I did as I always did. I got up, got dressed and ate, then headed out and hit the path as early as I could. One thing to note, I had gone this exact same route the day before, and nothing was out of place. About a quarter of a mile into the path, I ran into the body of an animal. That may be gross to most people, but living in nature kind of desensitizes you to animal death. There are so many predators out there, bears, wolves, etc., that you kind of just accept when you see a carcass, and you put yourself in a bit of a defensive mentality in that there may be a predator nearby. Now, this kill was fairly fresh, so that as well puts you in a position where you watch your surroundings even more. The main thing I found to be odd about the carcass was that the head was missing. Again, a bit strange, but nothing too crazy. Animals do weird things. I continue down the way and make my way toward the pond when I see something that legitimately makes me sick to my stomach. Down by the water, I see what looks like a shovel or spade or whatever stuck in the ground near the water's edge, and on the end of the stick that's pointed up is the head of an animal. I'm assuming it's the head of the one that I found down on the trail, as it's a deer and it also looked rather fresh. This alone was enough to scare the hell out of me. As I got closer, I saw that there were a pile of Polaroids scattered around the ground near where the shovel was. I hesitantly stepped forward to look at the pictures, and they were just as sick as you might think. The pictures were basically each a part of the timeline of how the people that killed this deer did so, and then beheaded it. There were about 15 pictures total, and they were each taken at different points. There were 2 people, but they were wearing masks and dark clothing. Like I said, this path was clear the afternoon prior, which meant that whoever did this did so in the middle of the night. I'm sure they were doing it to be edgy, but it was absolutely disgusting. I ended up heading home and calling the police. They came and took the evidence, which was pretty much just the pictures and the shovel, and they had park services come out to clean up the scene. I'm pretty sure they never actually caught anyone, which lends more to the possibility of it being a tourist that did it. The other story I have is one that's less straightforward and is more on the probability side. Like I said, there was a cave that was down by the pond, and it was a fairly large cave. I spent many days in my summers checking it out, and I'm certain that I never found every vein that it actually had, mostly because I didn't really try, and the situation proved that was the right way to do things. On this particular day, a friend of mine and I had decided that we would go through part of the cave that I hadn't yet explored. This was an idea that he'd had that I honestly wished he hadn't. We got to the cave and we started to explore. Pretty much nothing was out of place until we got back to the far left and into a vein that we never traveled. Back in the rear vein, there was a small pocket that pretty much looked to be the size of a small room. Inside this pocket, There was what looked like a makeshift bed made of a sleeping bag and some clothing. There were posters that were basically taped to the walls of the cave in a sloppy manner. There were a handful of books that were scattered around. While this was creepy, the part that made it worse was that there was also a lantern lying on the ground that was still lit, which told me that whoever was staying in the cave wasn't too far away. Now, you may think that's not that bad, it's just a homeless person making the most of what was available. The problem in this lies with the fact that we lived near a federal prison, and there had been escaped inmates in the past, and around the time we found this, there was an inmate that had gotten through the fence and hadn't yet been found. Odds are what we found was the camp where an escaped inmate was hiding out. Of course, at the time, as a kid, I didn't realize this. We just bolted out of the cave and laughed about it, and we never went back to the cave, or at least never deep into it. I don't live in South Dakota anymore, but if I did, I can promise you that I'd probably still be out there every weekend, just like back then. So that, my friends, was a collection of in the woods stories about things that happen when we're supposed to be in the woods and enjoying nature that are not pleasant, and that's not okay. But I've also never been a real big camping and woods person. I like some things, but I don't like the idea of camping or bugs getting on me. So I'll pass. And if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts or let me know what's your favorite word. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.